What better place to talk about this giant-ass camera than next to that giant-ass rock? As you can see in the frame, they're exactly the same size, and I get to carry this around today. Welcome back, DPReview TV viewers. It is Chris Nichols here, and I've got the Nikon Z9 in my hands. And you know, we've really been playing with this camera since it was first announced. We had our launch video in Seattle. Jordan did a whole talk about its video features on the Nikon Z9, and we did also cover the firmware 2.0, which adds a lot to the table. Today, we're not going to be covering features and specs and that kind of stuff. We've already done that. We really want to talk about our final thoughts with the Nikon Z9 and really talk about, if you've got the budget and you're looking for a serious full frame camera, is this the one to get? That's what we're going to talk about today. And that's the weather that we're gonna get. But this is actually the first time we've been able to shoot raw files on a Nikon Z9. It's funny, when we did the shot in Seattle, that was a pre-production unit. We played with the 800mm lens. That was pre-production. We weren't allowed to shoot RAWs. So I'm gonna just get what I get today, have fun, probably a lot of black and white. But go to DPReview.com. You can look at our sample gallery after today. As well, the staff in Seattle, they've shot some beautiful, colorful sample shots that you can absolutely download and play with because they've got great weather in Seattle. It's not art, it's a sample. So the first factor in whether the Z9 might be right for you or not is the obvious one. It's a big, heavy camera, and no amount of new firmware is going to change that. Now again, keep in mind that back in the day, professional bodies, SLRs, DSLRs, they were this size and weight, and it does give you a very stable platform, even if you're shooting slow shutter speeds, especially when you consider the fact that this doesn't even have a shutter to worry about. But I still do get it. I mean, I would have preferred this body to be smaller or have a removable battery grip, so at least I have the option. And I know a lot of people online are hoping, oh, I can't wait for all this technology to make its way into like a Nikon Z7 II style body. I get it. I'd be right there with you. Now, if you do want a smaller form factor, you're going to either have to wait to see what Nikon comes up with next, or maybe look at the Sony A1, which is a very fast, capable camera in a compact body. But a large camera like this does give you lots of space to give you great ergonomics and controls, which this camera has, and a big part of it is that large battery, especially with the new firmware where a lot of things like higher EVF refresh rate and the new video features take up a lot of battery life. You're going to want to have this, and I wonder what they're going to have to do to make that feasible with a smaller body and smaller batteries. So next, let's talk about the EVF, because this is really one of the harshest criticisms you're going to field against the Nikon Z9, and in some cases for good reason. Like, to be fair, this is a 3.69 million dot EVF, which is absolutely usable, but when you consider this to be a flagship professional body, I do feel it should be higher. In a lot of situations, it's very smooth shooting. You don't notice the resolution that much, but if I want to do things like play back my photos, check that things are sharp, really check the high resolution that the sensor's capable of delivering, I do prefer having a higher resolution EVF. And a lot of other cameras have that. Now, the other thing is going to be the actual refresh rate, because again, sports, action, wildlife, you generally want a higher EVF refresh rate than 60 frames per second. Now, in its defense, the EVF has basically no lag. So even at 60 frames per second, it's very easy to track moving subjects, wildlife, animals. And now with the latest firmware, you can up that to 120 frames per second. So it's completely a moot point. There's no downside going to that 120 frames per second as far as image quality goes. Everything stays nice and crisp and lag free. You just lose a little bit of battery life. So overall, we now have a very capable EVF for shooting sports, action, and wildlife. The only question is going to be, is that 3.69 million dot resolution going to hurt you? And if you are doing things like manually focusing for videos or trying to look back on your photos and really check detail, it can be a bit of a detriment. That's the only thing I keep in mind if you're looking at buying the Z9. Now, one of the standout features of the Nikon Z9 is that it is a shutterless camera, right? It's only shooting in electronic shutter mode 100% of the time. And that's really cool, but it also does bring up some questions when it comes to image quality, and that's questions that you may have and questions that we certainly had when we first played with the camera, so let's address those. So the first thing is this. We haven't encountered it ourselves. There are some rare situations where high-frequency LED lights and artificial lights might cause flicker, and there's not much you can do about that because, of course, there's no way that you can use a mechanical shutter. So tweaking shutter speeds, trying to find different lighting, that might be a situation that you have, but it's pretty rare. So the next big question we had with the Nikon Z9 was when it came to dynamic range. Because you see, the majority of camera platforms, when you shoot in electronic shutter mode versus mechanical shutter mode, you actually lose dynamic range. Now in the Z9, yeah, you still lose dynamic range and there's no mechanical shutter to go back to. Now on a day like today where you don't have a lot of contrast, it's going to be a non-issue. But when push comes to shove, in a really contrasty situation, you are at a disadvantage here with the Z9. And if you compare it against cameras like the Z7 II, the D850, the Sony A1, this will actually have slightly worse dynamic range. However, first thing to keep in context here, it natively shoots ISO 64, so it already had an advantage in dynamic range compared to other brands of cameras. So although we do lose a little bit here, we're still very comparable. We really don't consider it a major issue. In most situations, you're not even going to notice it. So the last thing that we're kind of curious about is, if we're shooting in the lossy compressed RAW formats, how much image quality are you going to lose? Because the Nikon Z9 is a fast shooting camera, 20 frames per second, whether you're shooting lossless compressed or lossy compressed formats. But if you shoot lossless compressed, your buffer doesn't last very long. And if you're doing sports and action, you're definitely going to want to shoot more compressed, lossy formats. How much image quality do you lose? Well, when we saw the menu options bring high efficiency or high efficiency star, like what does that stuff mean? It felt kind of marketing gimmicky and I was skeptical, but the team in Seattle tested it extensively and really, even in the worst mode, high efficiency, you're going to see a little bit more noise in the shadows. It's really not a big deal. And so absolutely, if I need to extend my buffer, I would happily shoot in the high efficiency and high efficiency star formats. And I'm not really going to be bothered about the loss of image quality. And of course, if you don't need the extended buffer, shoot lossless compressed. It's beautiful. I mean, the Nikon Z9 also has excellent high ISO performance. And you know, because there's no mechanical shutter to cause any sort of shutter shock, it's a really sharp shooting platform just in terms of avoiding any sort of motion blur from the camera itself. So in conclusion, I mean, the image quality on the Z9 is excellent. Compared to the Sony A1, again, I just feel like it's neck and neck. Compared to the Nikon Z7 II, yeah, a little bit more DR with the Z7 II if you need it, but there's so many other things that make this camera a more capable platform when it comes to the build, you know, shooting sports and action, wildlife, that kind of stuff. I really don't think that image quality is a detriment here that you need to worry about if you're planning on buying a Z9. So if you're going to buy a flagship premier camera, it has to autofocus well. And I feel like we've had a good opportunity to test the Z9 in different situations. We've shot sports, we've shot track and field, we've shot animals with long lenses, wildlife, birds, and of course lots of portraits and other scenarios. And the Z9 absolutely performs. Face and eye detect, excellent. I mean, really responsive. I like that it actually picks up eyes and faces from further away than other platforms do. Animal detect, also excellent. Had really good results with that, shooting birds and wildlife, even with long lenses. And I do love how Nikon can automatically switch between different subject detection modes, and that actually works pretty consistently. Now 3D tracking, we've talked about how wonderful it is that it's back on a Nikon body, and it works great. I mean, it's very reminiscent to me of Sony's real-time tracking autofocus, and it's great to use for the exact same reasons as the Sony's, in that it's basically effective 95% of the time, simple implementation of just putting a box on a subject. It tracks it, it works great. You can use it from sports, action, portraits, into landscape, whatever you really want to do. Of course, you know, some situations, sports and stuff, it might lose tracking, and that's where you can just easily go back to zone focusing or, you know, wide area autofocus. You have those options as well, and it does work very well with their subject detection modes. So overall, you want a camera that's going to be autofocusing properly for any sort of situation, journalism, sports, portraiture, and the Z9 just covers that no problem. Nothing says the end of a southern Alberta road trip like a derelict gas plant. So on that note, let's end our trip here on the road and go to Jordy. He's going to talk about video next.
Jordan here to talk about the video capabilities of the Z9, which incidentally is filming me right now on not a terribly demanding scene, but I've used this camera to film a few episodes and I've just consistently truly enjoyed the experience, and a lot of that goes down to the video interface that Nikon has chosen to use. Very usable on the LCD. On the EVF, I like that you can use the AF on button to initiate video tracking. Is a very smart idea I wish everyone would do. And it just keeps getting better with the 2.0 firmware. We now have waveforms, and yes, I do wish that I could adjust the size and placement within the frame, but it's just so wonderful to have a manufacturer besides Panasonic adding waveforms to their cameras. For a full-featured professional camera that does photos and video, and really the only competition for the Z9 is the Sony A1, and the Z9 has a huge advantage in that if you're shooting 4K up to 60 frames per second, it is using oversampled recording from the 8K sensor, which means we're getting much more detailed and less noisy footage than the A1. Sure, you have the option to do 4K 60 subsampled, or shooting 4K 120, you will see a detail hit, but that just makes it comparable to the A1's video quality. Obviously, one of the things that video shooters are most excited about is this camera's ability to record internal RAW in a couple of flavors, and the real question is, how usable is that? Well, Nikon's new proprietary format is only editable in DaVinci Resolve and Edius right now, but the performance on it is excellent. Using Chris's laptop, we were able to cut it at a playable frame rate, 8.3K raw video, with a lot of control on the image. And the other thing that's really exciting is the file size of this. If you're not shooting 8.3K, 60 frames per second, something crazy like that, you're actually getting really usable file sizes on this. It is less than half the size of shooting equivalent ProRes RAW video. But I do think Final Cut, Premiere, and Avid users are going to feel a little bit burned, because if you want to use ProRes RAW video, the whole sensor, you're only getting line skipped RAW with this. Now, you can get a beautiful Super 35 image off of this camera, but that's really the most usable mode. Now, the good news is the internal compressed video is so good that for most people, unless you absolutely need the flexibility of really being able to push the white balance, I would stick to the internal compressed video recording. Okay, minor quibble, but I do want Nikon to fix this. By default, this camera has so much of the good video stuff disabled. Like if you cycle through your display settings, you're not going to see a histogram or waveform until you turn it on in the menu. It does an automatic shutoff after 1 minute, so you're constantly setting up a frame, and then the camera clicks off. And the 4K 60p oversampled footage is disabled by default. If you don't turn that on, you're getting subsampled. So Nikon, just give us all of the cool video features on by default. This is a professional camera. People know how to use those. Okay, Chris, I want a nice, tight, dramatic frame because I want to discuss how the Z9 compares to the best full-frame hybrid cameras out there, and I already touched on it kinda. This camera trounces the A1 with the internal RAW, the oversampled 4K, better assist tools. I just think it's a better video camera. But how does it compare to my favorite full-frame hybrid camera, the Panasonic S1H? Well, the S1H still has some real advantages, and we have the best fully articulating screen design that I've ever seen, a better EVF. In terms of monitoring, you've got things like vector scopes, you can resize the waveform, it's a little bit more intuitive, and if you need time code, it's actually got a threaded port on it, so that's not going to pop out. But for most people, I think the Z9 is going to be the better option, having that reliable autofocus, sharper video, access to internal RAW. I think that's going to be a whole lot more useful than some of those other niche features on the S1H. Now, bear in mind, this is also quite a bit more expensive, but also the S1H, if you need a hybrid camera, isn't the best photo camera out there, where the Z9 might be my favorite photo camera that I've ever used. So for the majority of people out there, I think the Nikon Z9 is the best hybrid camera available on the market.
So let's answer our original question. If you're looking for your first serious, high-end, hybrid camera to shoot both high-resolution stills and great video, is the Nikon Z9 the way to go? I mean, it is arguably the best hybrid mirrorless camera that we've used so far. And you probably should get it, or at least you can't get it. You should put yourself on a waiting list, I suppose. But there's just really not much competition otherwise. I mean, the Sony A1 is really it. It does take great stills, it does have very good video capabilities, and it is definitely more compact. You know, it's funny, we were driving in the car and Jordan was asking me, Chris, which one would you do if you were in this situation? And actually my first inclination was to say the Sony A1, and I was thinking because I don't really need that high-end video capability. I don't really personally use waveforms and stuff. That's stuff that Jordan does. But also, I'd be a hypocrite if I would go for a camera that has an integrated vertical battery grip, because I've talked so much about how I really don't like that. I do like the small size of the A1, and I could see myself carrying it around a lot more. But it's more expensive. It's a great tool, but it doesn't have soul. The Z9 just has soul. It feels like a camera. And the more and more that I use the Z9, I actually really enjoyed using it. I think I'd put myself in the third category. I'd be the person who's kind of holding on, hoping that Nikon's going to come with something that's more compact, but has basically the same feature set. For me, I think that would be really ideal. Final thoughts on the Nikon Z9. If you can live with the lower resolution EVF and the larger size, or if those two things just aren't even an issue for you, it's a no-brainer. Get the Nikon Z9. It really is the best way to go right now. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave your comments below how you feel about the Nikon Z9 right now. Otherwise, do check out DPReview.com. You can see our sample galleries that we did. As well, the staff in Seattle have their full review in article form. You'll definitely want to check that out. Like and subscribe, and we shall see you soon again, as always.